I for president, I for president, I for president, I for president.
This campaign ad for the Eisenhower presidential campaign of 1952, known as the Ike for President or I Like Ike ad, is probably one of the most well-known political ad campaigns in American history. So much so that the phrase I Like Ike is still well known today, 70 years later. But where did this ad come from, and why did it work so well? To start with the story behind the ad's creation and background, this was one of the first uses of television for a political campaign, since television ownership was still relatively new, with only 40% of homes in 1952 owning a television. The ad was the brainchild of Jacqueline Cochran, a US Air Force Reserve pilot and Eisenhower campaign aide. Cochran reached out to, of all people, Roy Disney, the brother of Walt Disney and co-founder of the Walt Disney Company, to create the ad for the Eisenhower campaign. But since the rules of the Union for Disney Workers prevented them from working on anything that favored any one political movement, the people who made the ad did so as unpaid volunteers after normal working hours had finished. The point of the ad was to be quick and memorable. In contrast to Eisenhower's Democratic rival, Adlai Stevenson, who aired his 30-minute long speeches on TV, the Eisenhower cartoon would be only a minute long. One thing to note about the ad is that apart from the elephant, the Republican Party is never mentioned or alluded to. This is because the Republicans wanted to appeal to a wide range of voters, including those who normally voted Democrat. Eisenhower himself tried to present his candidacy as not particularly partisan, even though he was running as a Republican. In fact, he did not openly declare himself a Republican until this election, and even had to be drafted into running. Eisenhower did not actively campaign in the primaries and was instead placed on the ballot by Republican Senator Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. Before this, there was even speculation that Eisenhower might run as a Democrat, but by this point, the Democrats were deeply unpopular, and Eisenhower sought to reform the government and thought that would be easier as part of a new Republican administration rather than with the Democrats, who by this point had been in power for 20 years and were widely seen as being corrupt. This also meant that Eisenhower wouldn't have to defend past government policy. The Ike for President ad, in contrast to the mostly negative campaigning of today, tries to strike a cheerful and optimistic tone with its jaunty music and bouncing logo, with people from all walks of life, urban and rural, men and women, marching in happy unison. The three donkeys in the ad, named John, Dean and Harry, are references to John Sparkman, the Democratic vice presidential candidate, Dean Acheson, the Secretary of State, and Harry Truman, the Democratic president. Eisenhower's Democratic opponent, Adlai Stevenson, is referenced by name and can be seen going the other way in the background of one shot. To cap off the ad's bipartisan appeal, it doesn't finish with a Republican slogan, but rather the phrase,
"Now is the time for all good Americans to come to the aid of their country."
The ad was wildly successful, and most people who saw it responded positively. But the Democratic candidate Adlai Stevenson criticized the ad, saying that it degraded the political campaign and said that the Eisenhower campaign was selling the presidency like breakfast cereal. How can you talk seriously about issues with 1-minute spots? Obviously in 1952, Stevenson had yet to hear about YouTube Shorts. But in the end, the Democrats could see they were falling behind in the new television media and were forced to quickly change tactics. They would go on to air their own 1-minute commercial, but instead of being animated, it was a static shot of a woman singing the slightly bizarre campaign song, "We Love the Gov," in reference to Stevenson being the governor of Illinois. Obviously, this wasn't nearly as popular as the I Like Ike ad. Despite being a great success, the ad campaigns probably did little to decide the election results, as Eisenhower won in a landslide, even winning some states in the solid South that usually voted Democrat, such as Texas and Virginia. As for the Democrat Adlai Stevenson, his political career would continue during the presidency of John F. Kennedy. Stevenson would later also have an impact on popular culture, since according to actor Peter Sellers, the timid, fictional president, Merkin Muffley, in Stanley Kubrick's movie Dr. Strangelove, is based on Adlai Stevenson. Eisenhower, for his part, would serve 2 full terms as president, presiding over both the booming prosperity of the 1950s and the enforcement of the beginnings of the civil rights movement, such as the Brown versus Board of Education decision, and was still very popular at the end of his time in office. Eisenhower was actually the first president who was unable to stand for a 3rd term under the provisions of the 22nd Amendment to the Constitution, although many wished Eisenhower could have run again in 1960 instead of his vice president, Richard Nixon. And so the 1952 presidential election changed much in America, ending 20 years of democratic rule and seeing the introduction of television as a political tool. In fact, only 8 years later, in 1960, we would see the first ever presidential debate between the two party candidates on live TV, and from then on, political campaigning would be changed forever.
We'll take Ike to Washington.
Now is the time for all good Americans to subscribe to Newsreel History, and I'll see you next time.